Hello, good morning, Assalamualaikum, and we come to this L-T9, which is the second last lecture. Then you have L-T10, which is a similar lecture to this. There are 3 lectures focused on the origins and evolution of architectural theory. And the first 2 concentrate on the turn of the century, of the 20th century, or the turn of the 20th century. And the last one will be more current. So there are 2 lectures that were presented pre-recorded. So we'll get to this lecture. This lecture, some of it were presented already by the students, especially on Expressionism, and also Expressionism and also Stijl, I think, or is about to be presented. I've forgotten it. Who presented Rietveld? Anybody presented Rietveld? If not, then I'll cover it here. Now, I'm also supposed to make somebody else as well as co-host. Okay, I've done that. Okay, this will be recorded. Now, because of the mixed bag of lectures that comes earlier and some of the students already covered it, so I would like to apologize for any repeats. But let me explain about what happened at the turn of the 20th century. In 1849, Bismarck, let's see what this chancellor, or it's not the emperor, but it's the head of state in what you call the German states at that time, appointed, he got hold of a remark by Gottfried Semper in 1849, because a lot of things happening was in the United Kingdom or Britain. There was the Industrial Revolution, there was the arts and crafts movement in England, and England was regarded as much more sophisticated in architecture and design and in the society in general, much more advanced in technology. But if you were to think about it now, then the other countries are already more advanced than England, right? And especially Germany. What happened in Germany was they were really thinking that they need to compete. And so they got Hermann Matthesius to sort of spy on England. I mean, he visited England and he reported it or published it in the book called Das English House, the English House. And before that, we have Peter Behrens doing exploring concrete architecture. Le Corbusier worked with him, a lot of them, Mies van der Rohe, and the AEG factory that was presented earlier. So you also have this thing called the Deutscher Werkbund, which is an association established in 1907. But this is a earlier span of time. And after that, it was also done again after the World War II. But this was the flourishing time. They had the Werkbund exhibition and Bruno Taut's glass pavilion. The glass pavilion is kind of like a very experimental architecture using all glass in 1914. Other individuals such as Van der Velde also led the Deutscher Werkbund. A lot of artists, architects, designers, industrialists were associated with Deutscher Werkbund. At one point, there were about 1,000 plus associations in Germany associated with it. And off it came the Bauhaus. We talked about the Bauhaus. This particular diagram focuses on Deutscher Werkbund and the Stijl, which is another thing that's happening, and mostly in Holland, Netherlands, and Belgium, and some of the other countries in Europe. So, did I record this? Oh, yes, I do. Okay, then Einstein Tower was presented earlier. I also get kind of curious about Einstein Tower by Mendelsohn. And I think it was presented as well. And then Rudolf Steiner on Gothanium, which is this spiritual movement that led to education, not reforms, but some sort of development. So these are some of the keywords that is important to know with regard to Expressionism. This is the original Expressionism. It links to as well the art movement on Expressionism, the Deutsche Werkbund. W is pronounced V in German. You know, Volkswagen. Volkswagen. You know, V in Volkswagen is actually Volkswagen. V is F, W is V. Okay, anyway, I got confused myself. So just a quick note there. And the Stijl. This is some of the architects and individuals that associated with Expressionism. Hans Poelzig, Taut, Mendelsohn, Steiner, Scharoun later on, and Michel de Klerk, which is based in the Netherlands. Okay. It's not my favorite subject, but Expressionist architecture was an architectural movement in Europe during the first decades of the 20th century in parallel with the Expressionist visual and performing arts that especially developed and dominated in Germany. Brick Expressionism is a special variant of this movement in Western and Northern Germany and the Netherlands, bracket Amsterdam School. So the term Expressionist architecture initially described the activity of the German, Dutch, Austrian, Czech, and Danish avant-garde from 1910 until 1930. Subsequent redefinitions extended the term backwards to 1905 and also widened to encompass the rest of Europe. Okay, but today, the meaning has broadened even further to refer to architecture of any date or location that exhibits some of the qualities of the original movement, such as distortion, fragmentation, and those other characteristics. And in lecture L8, we have some of new Expressionism examples in Zaha Hadid and the other architects. Okay, so this particular architecture, there's some notes there. Hans Poelzig was also known for his distinctive 1919 interior redesign of the Berlin Grosses Schauspiel House for Weimar impresario Max Reinhardt. Okay, this is the architectural set design for the 1920 UFA film production of The Golem, How He Came to the World. Isn't that in the Lord of the Rings? Anyway, so this is the interior done by Hans Poelzig. Ornamentation was debated, obviously. People who were more into like Adolf Loos and the other modernists, they weren't really favorable with Expressionism, but this is a parallel development to modern architecture. So just to let you know that. So this is quite decorative, ornamental. The ornaments are more exuberant in the expression, yeah? And if you were to do a set design, well, you're doing a wedding, so you know, some sort of ornamentation may arise out of your wedding design, gallery, bridal center. As I mentioned earlier, Bruno Taut's glass pavilion is no more there, is demolished, but he explored circular form and how the glass could fit into that dome or some sort of dome structure, which is the roof, and glass blocks and glass, anything was, they tried to use glass throughout the whole building with concrete. Other works by Hans Poelzig using Art Deco elements or the horizontal bands and vertical bands in curvilinear buildings. The expression is always curvilinear. So a lot of you are actually neo-expressionists if you're using a lot of circular forms. So this was nothing new. It was in the last century, about 100 years ago. And some points there, apart from what I've mentioned. Yeah, the style was characterized by the early modernist adoption of novel materials, new materials. Glass was somewhat, glass and steel was new at that time to explore. Because when you think about glass, not just for the window, but also in terms of the strength of it, how it can be strengthened to use in the bigger span, and not just small-ish, but in the bigger span of the fenestration. Formal innovation and very unusual massing, sometimes inspired by natural biomorphic forms. So the new technical possibilities. And with it is the mass production. The mass production, the issue of mass production at that time was a very big deal. And architects trying to explore all these new materials and how to, that's how Germany, when you look at the timeline that I showed earlier, the diagram earlier that I showed, they were competing with all the other nations, and Bauhaus and the Deutscher Werkbund led to them doing the Mercedes-Benz and the BMWs. And you can see there the niche that they occupy in industrialization, yeah, and the mass production of commodities, such as the production of industrial products, such as vehicles. And later you have Japan, who emulate Germans and the other Western countries going ahead with their production of vehicles. And what it is that the standardization based on because mass production brings about products that need to be standardized for safety, usability, and all these other issues. So Deutsche Industrie Mark, or DIN, is the standard. After that came the British standard. At that time, German was really going far ahead with their competition, the competitiveness in terms of mass production of industrial products. Yeah. So economic conditions, yeah, things happened in 1914, the World War I. 1918, it stopped for a while, and then it continued in 1930. So there were lots of this disturbances in terms of what happened in the war, and issues of housing became of concern after the war. So, yeah, this is the definition of the Werkbund and a mention of the glass house. Okay, they're still concerned with the ancient tradition, even in the work of Rudolf Steiner and many of them. They were concerned that what industrialization would do is to actually obliterate or destroy their tradition. And they thought as spiritual objectives important, and also the human emotion. So that was one of the characteristics of the Expressionists at that time. This was presented earlier, the Einstein Tower by Erich Mendelsohn, Astrophysical Observatory in the Albert Einstein Science Park in Potsdam, Germany. So they were ahead of themselves. The sketch below, you see, is more expressionistic. Then the one on top was the finished design that they built. Can you see the difference in terms of the flourish of the form? There's almost like a ship below there. It's an observatory tower where you have a, what do you call it, a telescope, and to observe the skies, what do you call that, planetary movements in the night sky and so on, with a strong magnifying telescope. And one could see that such structures to do with science, technology, they become like a favorite of them, you know, to explore the form, something new, a new type of architecture and building. And, you know, this is justify the exploration of the form. So you can see the inside of it where the telescope is set as well, higher up, and the cut away axonometric on the left, but they sort of advance more than what technology can do at a time. So one would think that this is concrete, but I said it before, I think that this is actually brick infill. So the limitations in terms of construction and their continued interests in developing the forms in concrete later. So you can read further on this. Influenced by the work of expressionist artists of the time, such as the painter Wassily Kandinsky and designer Hermann Obrist, Mendelsohn began to search for new methods of construction that will allow expression freedom. Yeah, so there is some form of concrete, but he couldn't like explore it like everything is concrete, you know? There are brick infill. So this is a lot of words and keywords and statements that they want to do. You know, they get excited about steel in combination with concrete, reinforced concrete, building material for formal expression, for the new style, the relation between support and load, and this apparently eternal law will also have to alter its image. Yeah, that is the justification for the architect to the client or those who are funding the project, that, you know, that there is an objective that is beyond just merely architecture design. Einstein Tower, yeah, one thing is also, it's called Einstein Tower, as you know, Einstein. A potent symbol of expressionism, figured centrally in the German architecture debates. Nationalism was important at the time, as you can know from the World War I and World War II. Intention of why the World War was created was to do with that as well. The fascism rose in Italy and Germany in the World War II, especially. Debate whether architecture should prioritize expression or pure functionalism as represented by the international style. So it's in contrast to the international style. And we're having to look back. It's clear that today, almost 100 years later, that functionalism would dominate rather than expressionism. And this tower, the Einstein Tower, remains an interesting and unique counterpoint to the modernist style. And I was talking also about Rudolf Steiner. Started thinking about Semper, Gottfried Semper's writing on material functionalism, but he advocated a more intuitive design style. There are no 90 degrees angle here because they believe in theosophy. I think theosophy is the philosophy, and many of the buildings are connected with educational or spiritual buildings. It's an anthropomorphic architecture for the anthroposophical society. Okay, organic architecture. But some of it more rectilinear, like Michel de Klerk. In 1917, the Amsterdam School is a group of architects that started with Berlage. Berlage, some of you pronounce Berlage, I think it's Berlage. And he was the the one who started it in the beginning with the Stock Exchange building. One of our students presented that already. So Michel de Klerk was in that group, and he expressed more on the brickwork. His brickwork is very interesting. He does all sorts of manner of how to use the brick and different colors as well. This is not something new, because in Gothic, new Gothic revival in the 19th century, there were a lot of exploration in brickwork, but this manifests itself after the turn of the century. Much of the building is like housing or institutional buildings. And the later part of Expressionism in the modern architecture period in the last century was in the 1960s with Hans Scharoun Berliner Philharmonie. And one would, you juxtapose this with Frank Lloyd Wright's Robbie House that we talk about. That's organic architecture in the use of material. And then you can expand organic architecture definition to those who are using much more fluid forms and anthropomorphic forms like this. And also the one with the rectilinear, circular and rectilinear forms on the left is kind of interesting when you combine both. You don't necessarily have to be a blob. Yeah. We go now to the Stijl. I used to call it the Stijl, not the Stijl. The Stijl or the Stijl? I used to call it the Stijl, now I have to call it the Stijl. So I'm so used to calling it the Stijl. The Netherlands-based Stijl movement embraced an abstract, pared-down aesthetic centered on basic visual elements such as geometric forms and primary colors. So partly a reaction against the decorative excesses of Art Deco, the reduced quality of the Stijl art was envisioned by its creators as a universal visual language appropriate to the modern era, a time of a new spiritualized world order. Led by the painters Theo Van Doesburg and Piet Mondrian, its central and celebrated figures, the Stijl artists applied their style to a host of media in the fine and applied arts and beyond, promoting their innovative ideas in their journal of the same name. The members envisioned nothing less than the ideal fusion of form and function, thereby making the Stijl, in effect, the ultimate style. To this end, the Stijl artists turned their attention to not only fine art and media, but also other forms, art forms as well, industrial painting and sculpture, industrial design, typography, even literature and music. It's so interesting about typography and how Apple made computing fun with typography. I mean, the writing style. Yeah, even literature and music. So anyway, the Stijl also explored that typography. So it helped to give rise to international style of the 20s and 30s. Piet Mondrian composition with red, yellow, and blue, 1921. When I talk about abstract art and the way of looking at something, realism, right? When you just look at any object and you want to sketch it as it is, that's more of the romanticism before this expressionists, and Impressionist movement of the art era at the turn of last century, right? So, the shadows, even the shadows is questioned. So when we talk about abstract art and looking at it, picking up elements and representing it in different way, so we can see that it's the extreme, but of course, the more extreme one is Malevich and the suprematists later on. And also we touched upon that. But why are these lines like that? Why they're spaced out near to each other in space? They are representation of space and how you would use the primary colors as well. And often this Piet Mondrian's work influenced also the architectural work that's going on in the Stijl group of artists and architects, which you will see later. And some of it were influenced by Michael Graves' building in the 1960s. So, but we start with something that I can describe better, I think. Theo Van Doesburg, one of the protagonists in the Stijl movement, also one of the leading figures. On the left is the Russian dance, and on the right is the cow in 1918. Can I see? Oh, okay. There is a set of slides of how the cow came about. And it is literally from an abstraction of the object. The object is reduced to like geometrical forms and shapes. And either that or the movement or the steps, such as in the Russian dance. You know that you can use this for your how you approach architecture in your design. Yeah, seriously. But whenever you approach your architectural design, you need to learn. You can't just do out of the blue. You need to study about these things. And even Piet Mondrian earlier, they were inspired by the mathematician Schoenmakers at that time. And yeah, there are mathematics to this. What I'm trying to say, I'm bad at mathematics, but we can see the sense of rhythm and proportion to each of this. Even the space in between, the white space, it has something to do with the whole composition. And architecture is like that also. The in-between space is important. Okay, let's see. Acting on his mission to inform people of the tenets of the Stijl, Van Doesburg extracted the image of a grazing cow. How common could that be? A scenery and there's a cow there. So beginning by creating figurative studies and gradually changing the image until the cow became a carefully coordinated arrangement of colorful rectangles and squares. Van Doesburg used this composition as well as preliminary studies in a treatise on the Stijl that he distributed for educational purpose. So a lot of people who are the protagonists or the leader of a movement, they have to go and illustrate something. So what he sought out to do was illustrate this. This painting is part of the artist's early foray into the Stijl, demonstrate his passion for the burgeoning movement. Okay, so what it is to abstract in abstract art, there's a thing at that time when you have the Impressionists and the likes of, the Cubism, before that, the Monet and the Manet, Cézanne, and more of Monet and Manet and Impressionists, where, if you go near to the painting, you cannot see the paint, just dots. But when you go far away from the painting, you can see a composition of people in a park or something and made up of a series of dots. So they were thinking this dots, this abstract, how to explore this idea that you could represent something realistic to something abstract. Okay, so the Stijl aesthetics, and this developed later. We stop to see the definition of the Stijl. The Stijl, artistic movement founded in 1917, Body of work created by a group of Dutch artists from 1917 to 1931. This is the same time with the Deutscher Werkbund, as you notice, and the Bauhaus as well. So they interchange with each other. The Stijl is also the name of a journal which was published by the painter and critic Theo Van Doesburg. And then you have other people joining this group, the painters, Piet Mondrian, Van der Lack, artists, architects, Rietveld and Oud, okay? And this formed the basis of the group's work known as neoplasticism, or the new plastic art. New plastic art has all to do with surface. The model for this chair is a traditional overstuffed club chair. We're talking about this chair. This chair is worth studying, you know, the Vasily chair in 1927 by Marcel Breuer, who is part of the Stijl movement, and also, coincidentally, the Bauhaus. The model for this chair is a traditional overstuffed club chair, but all that remains is mere outline, an elegant composition traced in gleaming steel. The canvas seat, back and arm seems to be floating in space, and the body of the sitter does not touch the steel framework. Breuer spoke of the chair as his most extreme work, the least artistic, the most logical, and the least cozy, and the most mechanical. It was his most influential piece of design, taking furniture to a radical new direction. Breuer had designed an earlier version in 1925 while teaching at the Bauhaus, the influential German school of modern art, architecture, and design in Dessau. And within a year, designers everywhere were experimenting with tubular steel. So remember the Bauhaus experimented in different materials, and that was the great thing about the Bauhaus, where they experimented, and experimentation was the objective of their education. So therefore, when people start using tubular steel, like how Monsieur Breuer's chair is still something that is being reproduced even until today, the influence of that, you know, tubular steel handlebars of his bicycle, lightweight and mass produced. So Breuer actually inspired from his bicycle and the use of tubular steel into furniture. And so when he thought about the handlebars, it could be bent into forms, so furniture could as well. So Vasily Kandinsky was his friend, and his chair was named after him, who praised his design. Here again, another composition by Piet Mondrian, more of the square rather than the lines. The lines are subdued. And so here we have the experimentation in colors even more. Composition A, whose title announces its non-objective nature by making no reference to anything beyond itself. A good example of Mondrian's geometric extraction before it fully matured within the framework of the Stijl aesthetic, with its rectilinear forms made of solid outline areas of color. The work reflects the artist's experimentation with Schoenmaker's mathematical theory and his search for a pared down visual language appropriate to the modern era. Well, here Mondrian uses blacks and shades of gray. His paintings will later be further reduced, ultimately employing more basic compositions and only solid blocks of primary colors. So this was in 1921, okay. This was before that one. How that influenced architecture is notably to an interior designer and architect, Gerrit Rietveld. He actually built furnitures. And this is a much more natural, fluid development of a designer. It's not like he built buildings first and then he did teapots and paintings. He did this process of building a furniture first before he designed and built architecture that have similar design principles, taking into elements focusing on elements and rectilinear elements. He composed this red and blue chair, 1918 and 1923. Primary colors. So it doesn't look blue. I actually sat on this chair. I was lucky to went to exhibitions where I sat on a few of these chairs. This chair it's not very comfortable, but the idea was trying to do a chair, but using these elements rather than making it comfortable, just like Marcel Breuer did. But somehow many chairs are not comfortable, as you know it, right? So chair is a way to find a form or to find an architectural language, a design language or architecture language or vocabulary, and it's within our budget, or we can do it ourselves. Some needs to be prototyped and need some funding, obviously, if we want to mass produce it. But this chair wasn't meant to be mass produced. It was more of illustrating the concept or the idea of, it's a concept of a chair, but the idea of elementarism that is they learned from the artist Piet Mondrian. So here it is designed 1918, but not fully realized until 1923. Oh, it's 9:45 already, when it incorporated the characteristic of the Stijl scheme of primary colors. So you can read this later. I will share this PDF. Schroeder House by Gerrit Rietveld. In 1924, after the chair, Rietveld had a good client. You can see on the left the elevation of the building next to this building in a corner lot attached to the more traditional house on beyond it, and its design composition was inspired by the New York Five and later such as Graves, Meyer, and Eisenman. But at this time, 1923, there was a client, and the client said they wanted a much more flexible space. So if you look at the plan, the top and bottom plan, how the plan can reconfigure some of the partitions can be reconfigured to create a bigger space. That's a different floor plan, but you can see the one in the middle where they have the gray lines. That's how the space can be bigger or lessened. But this was a new thing at that time, you see. That's a new thing at that time. That is the IKEA thing is not really yet established. So, and the use of primary colors is also indoors, black, gray, and primary colors, monochromatic and primary colors. The Rietveld-Schroeder House, important precursor to the Bauhaus-inspired international style. It inspired the international style, obviously. I forgot to mention that one, obviously, as well as the only building designed in complete accordance with the Stijl aesthetic. It's intended to be grand and open without walls, and how an independent modern woman should live her life. Yes, featuring the typical Stijl plate palette, primary colors black and white, slabs, posts, and beams reflecting the movement's emphasis on form, construction, and function. Yeah, the functionalism aspect of it is very much here in the design. So it represented at that time a major departure from architectural convention because of the, you set it against the traditional house at the back. It's so different. Inside the rooms are constructed as movable entities with portable walls. So at the same time, 1924, Le Corbusier was also publishing his book, towards the new architecture and the 5 points of architecture. So these are some of the examples. If you were to do an exam and we were to ask you what are the influences at that time, you would cite this and also Le Corbusier's 5 points of architecture to be the most influential in terms of the international style. Okay. Oh, the client actually lived until they died here. That's very good space. That means it is a success, not only aesthetically, but also functionally. All right, thank you very much. And we shall move on to the next session with the group presentation.